morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Oraculos True Divination podcast, where I bring you ancient wisdom for the modern mystic. I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, and joining me today, all the way from Canada, is Mr. Will Morris. Will, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mychal. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm really excited to dive into our conversation today. We have a lot to talk about. But before we go into that, for those of you, if this is your first time joining us here on the Oraculos True Divination podcast, this is a podcast where I bring you interviews from astrologers all around the world who aren't just changing their own lives through their astrological practice, but they're also making contributions to our greater astrological landscape. So if you want to be a part of the magic and the momentum that we're building here on the Oraculos True Divination podcast, give yourself a moment, go down below, hit on the like button, but also subscribe to the Oraculos True Divination podcast so that you can receive notifications of when I bring you these interviews each and every week. Now, Will, once again, I'm super excited to have you here and to be speaking with you today because you are definitely blazing a trail for yourself and for all of us within the field of medical astrology. So thank you so much for taking time out to be here with me.
Oh, you bet. It's one of my great passions in life, and it's been with me since, my late teens. Yeah.
Good stuff. So Will, take us back on a journey through time and tell us a little bit about you, how it is you came to astrology, and how it is you specifically came into the field of medical astrology that you're in today.
Okay. Well, I was on the road playing music, and so there's a lot of time in the afternoon. So I would go to the bookstore and get Dane Redger books. I also had a girlfriend give me a copy of the I Ching, and I received a copy of the Tarot. And I was studying psychic healing methods, and that was when the turn came about. I was 22 by that time, and we were working in Lake Tahoe, and I was exposed to this place called the Fourth Center, where we studied psychic healing processes. Anyway, by that fall, I had received an astrological reading that told me that I would be working in medicine and astrology, which didn't seem conceivable. But anyway, also that fall, I performed my first professional reading. So it was at age 22, and things began to happen. The tarot also took off. I left the road and began to pursue a career as an itinerant astrologer, providing readings and consultations in cafes and so forth. But I was also studying healing techniques. So by the age of 23, I was already doing some music, healing work, and astrology all combined together. And I would use really a post-theosophical method promoted by a man named Max Heindel, where starting with the black keys, you go all from Aries up, and then by the time you get to Virgo, you're onto the white keys, and then you go all around the white keys. So that's your key centers. There's 12 key centers, and then there's 7 basic planets, which give you the 7 church modes, or the 7 scale steps. And so I'd use that material with my clients, and we would play aspects that would be hard, and we could see the agitation and consternation arising in these individuals. And then I would use what was at the time from the Church of Light, is where I picked this method up, which would be to find a planet with an aspect of both a trine, let's say, and a sextile to an opposition. And then I would play that frequency, and it would create some sense of a resolve in these people. And I did this experimentation on numerous clients at the time, and it worked very well. And so I've continued that since then, but really, I'd say about 79, right around 79, I met Eileen Nauman, who's a medical astrologer, and has published a book on the topic. And she said to me, if you want to be a medical astrologer, you have to study medicine, which was like, of course, that's true. That makes perfect sense. So I was fortunate enough I began my pre-med studies, but I was fortunate enough to get exposed to a Chinese medicine school, which is a humerally centered form of care, right? Hot, cold, moist, dry, even as the early Greek, all the schools of thought back in the Greco-Roman period, which is also consistent with the Han Dynasty in China, knowledge is being transferred back and forth. And the medical models that are coming up, these proto-scientific medical models, are dealing with fundamental concepts, hot, cold, moist, dry, which fits directly into the astrological consideration. And anyway, so fortunate as I was to get exposed to that as my first, well, not my first form of medical care. My first was homeopathy. I was working at Cedars-Sinai Hospital office towers there in Los Angeles, making homeopathic remedies, working with the herbs, and doing all this. And that was before going into the Chinese medicine school situation. It all just wove together in a very beautiful fabric of this warm, assuring sense of certainty that this is the path, that's the work. And because when I was on the road playing music, there was an uncertainty, a sense of like, this is not quite it. And so when that began, that was really it. And so since that time, I've studied with all the astrologers I could find that I felt knew what they were doing. One of my first ones was, of course, Marianne March, and I still use methods that I learned from her today as a part of my focus. But discovering the way that the herbal medicine wove with that required that I also study Ayurveda, and also because the Ayurvedic consideration had a living tradition of combining astrological considerations with herbal considerations, which was not true for the Western tradition. It had fallen apart in the post-Enlightenment period, and the integrity of the most world-class herbal astrological practitioners, such as Lilly, Salmon, and so forth, was the thread of continuity was lost. Anyway, I studied with Olivia Barclay, who was coming up out of the Renaissance tradition, and who taught horary methods. So based on the methods that I learned from her back in the 90s, I would leave a computer running in my office, and I would watch the charts come up, or the wheel would arise, as I would then go to see a patient. And this provided me just a wealth of experience, because this is going on with a pace of about 40 to 50 patients a week that I'm glancing at the chart, seeing the patient. So the methods that I've developed in my practice are rooted in a very strong sense of practical application, clinical, but also with an awareness of having supported the Project Hindsight work since the early 90s, studying Ayurveda, so Greco-Roman period, then coming up into medieval Renaissance period, and then also, of course, postmodern concepts such as cosmobiology and then vibrational astrology. Those of all, every one of those has had an impact on how I see medical astrological astrology as a discipline, but also as a tool for making some kind of contribution to that discipline that is rooted in a what I call a transdisciplinary synthesis of these materials. In other words, that transdisciplinarity is looking at the discipline over time and across cultures. Yes.
Well, I think that it's really beautiful how you found yourself studying traditional Chinese medicine, and how you found this singular theme of classical approaches to medicine within the traditional Chinese framework, because in medical astrological circles, we tend to see parallels within the context of Ayurveda. And we also tend to see parallels within the context of Islamic approaches to medicine, because the Arabic countries came up with their Unani Tim. I think that's what it's called.
Yes, it's Unani Tim.
Right.
And it's really rooted in the Greco-Roman
precisely
frame of thought. Yes.
Precisely. So we tend to be able to follow this train of lineage through the Islamic world and through India in terms of how that's been codified in Ayurveda, but we don't really seem to see the parallels between our own traditional approaches and the traditional Chinese approaches to medicine, or at least on the surface, it seems as if they're two completely different things. But I think what I hear you saying is that they really do share the same fundamental basis.
Well, the fundamental basis is, of course, the patient, which will always be that way. Now, the astrological consideration certainly lends itself better to a humerally centered, which would be a pre-modern. And that pre-modern context is similar across all pre-modern proto-scientific views and indigenous views. So that's going to be inclusive of Native American, Unani Tib, of course, and Southern folk medicine in the U.S., which is actually rooted in the Greco-Roman theory. And they were isolated from the influences of contemporarized medicine and its economic emphasis. So what we can see is, in particular, psychiatric forms, in the forms of Jung, because as we know now, of course, as a result of the work of Liz Green, that Carl Jung was constructing astrological charts before most of his psychiatric interviews. So this becomes very significant, and much of what he's describing when people get into character modeling is really coming straight up out of the humoral model of the melancholic, choleric, phlegmatic, and sanguine temperaments, which is later. It's a little bit later than the Stoic period, where you have a strict formation of hot, cold, moist, and dry. And so then, of course, you have cosmobiology, which has essentially its roots in Uranian astrology, whereby many of the people who are involved in that consideration were physicians. So there you have a class of Western physicians looking at the problem of astrology and developing a body of evidence for its use. Now, for me, it's this matter of, if I'm going to make an astrological consideration for the purposes of medicine, what is it informing? And so when it comes to contemporized medicine, we look at Dr. Charak from India, who's a surgeon practicing medical astrology. He's using it primarily for prognosis and for electing surgical times for surgical procedures. That's his primary focus. He's not using it for the humoral consideration, because that's not his worldview in his medical practice. But he gives a very solid medical astrology course. I took this course back in the early 90s and met many Vedic astrologers in that course. It was fantastic. But what we're left with is, how can I use the astrological consideration for making a recommendation, either herbal or homeopathic, lifestyle, nutritional supplements, dietary recommendations, and then lastly, where I spend a lot of time these days, is in sound healing techniques, the selection of particular frequencies to generate some form of a healing process. So there's a whole range of interventions that can be informed by the astrological consideration, which extend beyond that of selecting, say, a pharmaceutical or a surgical intervention or some form of physical therapeutic intervention, and so forth.
So, Will, could you give our listeners a definition for what is medical astrology as a field, without even going into the various levels of it? Is there a broad definition of what medical astrology is itself?
Yes, simply put, medical astrology is the use of astrology to inform medical decision-making. That would be the most simple way that it could be put. and that would reach across the bounds of all the forms of intervention or remediation, if you will, that might be chosen based on that astrological consideration. And so my recommendation is always that if an astrologer wants to practice medical astrology, that they learn some form of remediation. Sound healing is particularly useful because it ties right into the planetary influences. But herbal medicine is a fantastic way to go. Manual therapeutics. We have people come to study with us that are doing body work and then use these methods. Or they may be already trained in herbal medicine and trained in astrological approaches to constructing herbal formulas, these types of things.
And your specific approach to medical astrology, it integrates the traditional Chinese medicine, it integrates the sound
Yes.
healing, and it integrates the herbs, yes?
Right. It uses sound healing and it uses herbs. And, well, I'll also use it for homeopathy. Well, I'll give you an example. In the homeopathic consideration, you have essentially three kingdoms: the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and the mineral kingdom. And they lend themselves well to the three modes of material nature. In other words, cardinal, fixed, and mutable. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's one way of identifying a level of coherence with respect to the discipline of homeopathy and the discipline of astrology. And then the idea of the cycle is tightly woven together with Chinese Taoist evolutionary concepts. And that's part of my book, Cycles in Medical Astrology, works with some of those concepts, both for herbs, but also sound healing techniques. Yeah.
So, well, tell us what you see as being the difference between the 17th century medical astrologer and the 21st century medical astrologer. How does the work that the two of you do differ?
Well, as a 21st century practitioner, I am exposed to a wider range of concepts. Now, in the 17th century, we know that European practitioners were exposed to Chinese medical concepts. There was a book written by a man named Floyer called The Physician's Pulse Watch, but it also had a whole sub-book on Chinese pulse diagnostic techniques. So I have a particular interest in the intersectionality of clinical skills, such as a pulse diagnosis, with that of the astrological chart, and they can be connected. So the thing is that because I'm sitting here in the 21st century, I've had exposure to the 20th century astrological techniques that came out of the Weimar Republic, right? And so Uranian cosmobiology, consequently also vibrational astrology, the use of midpoints, and now the use of midpoints was a little bit extant in the Renaissance period, because that's the Arabian parts are essentially midpoint structures. So they had access to some of that, but we don't see it used heavily. When in the medieval period, it was used very heavily, right? And so, different techniques gain primacy in different periods, partially because of the social context in which that practice is emerging. So this practice that's taking place now, a person may be exposed to any number of concepts, including post-Alan Leo type of modern astrology, which I've found to be the least effective. I don't mean to dismiss anyone or anything or any style of practice, but when I look around on the horizon, I want to know what's the most potent and effective tool to get me to a solution. It's all outcomes based. So if my client's getting better, that's it. And what I'm convinced of thoroughly is that I can write a better herb formula. I could do a better analysis, have better communication with the patient based on an astrological consideration than I can without it. And this I know at the depth of my bones. And so my work is centered on making that work available, what I've been able to discern as effective in my practice compared to that which is not necessarily as effective. And so things that are super powerful are midpoint structures in vibrational charts. Well, in India, there's some similar things because we look at symmetries between houses and through divisional charts. And this becomes an important consideration. So there's some coherences there. But the advantage of being in a position to operate as a transdisciplinarian relative to these things is, I'd say, the largest difference of practicing now to practicing then, because you don't have as much travel. So in the medieval period, for instance, a solar return, which I'm going to use if a person has the onset of a disease in a given year, but they can't locate a particular date or time. So I'm not able to do what's called decumbiture, that chart, which is calculated for when they come down with the disease, right? That was more prevalent during a period without as significant a medical intervention capacity as we have now in a technocracy, a medical technocracy. It gives us last minute interventions that saves lives that otherwise the astrological consideration would have suggested that the person wouldn't have made it, right? And so we know this. This is one of Lee Lehman's great messages, right? And but it's in her books and it's in her teachings, and I agree with her on that matter. But the thing is, the medieval practitioner must calculate the solar return for the location of the birth, because people didn't leave. They didn't go anywhere, right? Or they're dependent on the decumbiture because they don't have an actual date, even or time of birth, because only the privileged are really getting that kind of information. So now we have the privilege of some accurate birth time. It depends on which country the person's born in. Some countries emphasize this more than others. I've discovered this moving to Canada from the US. There's less attention to accurate birth records, timing of the birth record here than in the US. And even in the US, not necessarily. So, but point being, and I'm going to return to this concept, I don't think I emphasize it adequately enough that if a disease emerges in a particular year, the solar return for that year can provide significant information about the nature of that disease process. And with chronic debilitating diseases that come with increasing of the aging of the population, oftentimes it's not discernible as a moment in time when it began, but rather it just kind of crept in. And under those circumstances, that solar return is going to be really an excellent marker for understanding what's taking place and for driving inquiry. So I'm using this astrological chart for the process of driving inquiry. How can I understand better what's going on? If I see the nodal axis in conjunction with, say, the ruler of the sixth house, I'm going to want to be knowing about chronic infections that are latent or hidden and chronically re-emergent, one thing. Also, strange microbial phenomena that can pleomorph, shapeshift from one form to another depending on the terrain, and that's consistent with the nodal axis. We came across in India, of course, they're looking at, say, epidemics with strange viral contaminants as a combination of Saturn and the nodal axis of the moon, right? And this is consistent with how they approach mundane astrology in India for the purposes of understanding epidemics. But I was doing some research for the Kepler conference, presenting my research, some research on cycles, taking conventional medical research on day, month, year cycles, and I came across this one cycle using the nodal axis of the moon, 18.6 year cycle, looking at marsh bloom of mosquitoes in Massachusetts. Well, mosquitoes happen to be an important vector for the transmission of various forms of blood-borne disease. And so now all of a sudden we see a very literal connection between a cycle of the nodal axis and transmission of blood-borne pathogens, which can remain in the blood latent, and then when the person becomes decompensated and express itself. And one of the astrological considerations for that, of course, will be nodal axis involved with, sixth house situations or eighth house situations, so on and so forth.
An interesting point that I hear you bringing up, Will, is one, the transdisciplinary nature of the 21st century medical astrologer, which I completely love and admire, because I feel as if astrology on a whole should be in a place where it acknowledges a lot of the modern strides that we've made and a lot of the modern advancements that we've made with our astrology in the 21st century. And so it's very heartening for me to hear that as a traditionally trained medical astrologer, you are boldly willing to stand within your modernity and pick up a lot of the heritage of the early 20th century and 21st century within your medical astrology work. Because in pockets of astrology, we still have an astrology that isn't willing to take part in this dialogue between tradition and futurity.
Futurity. Yeah, the tradition and the, as a pragmatist, the only thing I really care about is what works. So, if I've got, if I'm able, one thing I'm very interested in, for instance, is the 27th harmonic chart. It's a 3 cubed chart, 3 times 3 times 3, 9, 3 times 9, 27. That vibratory frequency as a vibrational chart, and this comes from the vibrational astrological teachings, essentially, of David Cochrane, and which is, of course, he's getting it in large part from the cosmobiological view. But when it comes to sound healing, there's actually, I found nothing better than this. I use what's called a post-Keplerian view. If we use Pythagorean view on sound healing, we're dealing with monochords, what's called a monochord, and dividing strings and creating harmonics and this kind of thing. Post-Keplerian view, which is presented to us by a man named Hans Cousteau. Not Jacques, no relationship to Jacques and oceanography. Hans Cousteau took essentially the average orbital speed of planets and through a few mathematical operations developed some frequencies. These have been developed into tuning forks. We have a temple here in Kootenay Lake area of British Columbia, central British Columbia, where we have 18 gongs around the room. And we will take an astrological theme, often take an astrological theme, say take the midpoint structures for that moment, or we'll take the vibrational chart, dominant vibrational chart for that moment, which is, people call them harmonic charts, but they're not actually harmonics. So we call them vibrational charts. And from that, identify a planetary frequency that we zone in on as part of the theme for the healing event. And it's profound, it's powerful, and that's where a lot of our work is centered, is in teaching people these frequencies that are correlated with the planets based on mathematical operations on their orbital speed into what would be called a harmonia mundi of sorts. This will be a vibratory frequency of the world, as opposed to a harmonia humana, which would be the vibratory frequency at the level of humans, like singing, chanting, voice, versus the harmony of the spheres, which would be that of the heavens. So it's essentially taking vibratory frequency at the level of the heavens and ratcheting it down into the mundane, and creating an experience that shifts the humana in their perceptions of reality and in their ability to access various aspects of themselves. So if I'm able to find a vibrational chart which is the dominant, most potent, and I can find a midpoint structure in there, or a series of midpoint structures which have a single planet at the focal point, focal center of all those movements, what that means is I'm able to create a vibratory frequency that resonates at the deepest soul level, that brings about self-realization and awakening. And there's nothing more potent in the healing process than this moment of awakening. And these vibratory frequencies have the potency to bring the soul into a coherent presence with that awakening.
I completely love that vision. And as you were speaking, I was entering into that experience as well, because I, up until I dare say last year, was kind of on the fence in terms of the use of sound as a means of healing. And then I went to New Orleans, where a few sisters of mine have a very strong bhakti yoga environment where sound is a very critical part of their sadhana, their practice. And I attended a gong bath, and I also attended several sound healing events that completely melted me and completely allowed me to have what I dare say was similar to a cathartic release. And it was purely based on the sound and the way in which that sound doesn't just land on you, but the way in which that sound pierces through you, and it pulls up things and it pulls things out. And I'm a complete 100% believer because I've experienced it. And I think more people need to interact with sound in that way. But even deeper than that, I think that is very significant that you're taking all of your experience as a medical astrologer and weaving that into your experience in vibrational sound healing and creating something that is essentially even more potent than the two of those things separated.
I feel that it is. And I run an ongoing program here. It's online. It's usually a 10-week program. We're coming into the last week or two of this Med Astro for sound healing. And so all kinds of people come into it. Chiropractors who are also medical astrologers come in and study this, or acupuncturists, or body workers, astrologers who are seeking a tool. I think it's fantastic for astrologers, because oftentimes what we're doing with astrology is we do a consultation, and it may be a year before our client comes back. But with this type of work, the sound healing type of work, the astrologer can set, it's a procedurally centered interaction. So a series of those procedures can be scheduled, and it develops an arena where the astrologer can have more of a relationship with the client, such that a greater level of depth can be achieved in the astrological work on the basis of having performed sound healing work with the clients. It's pretty profound.
I think it's really significant how many astrologers are seeking to diversify their offerings today. I know that you and I share in common that we both studied with Vasan's lad in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And while I think I missed you by a couple of years, we were both in that same room at separate times. And when I was studying there, there were so many astrologers who were there in the audience as well, who were there studying pulse diagnosis, or who were there studying marmotherapy, or who were there studying some other aspect of, whether we call it spiritual healing or mystical intervention or whatever it is you call what an astrologer actually does, or what a healer of this sort actually does. They were in there studying because they wanted to diversify what it meant for a client to come with them and receive astrological work with them. And so it's not just about the astrology anymore, which, I mean, the astrology is wonderful and it will always be wonderful, but it's about building these bridges of connections between clients that go beyond the consultation moment and actually taking part in an ongoing process of healing for this person that goes far beyond that one interaction of reading their chart.
Absolutely true. I agree with that 100%. Pulse diagnosis happens to be, of course, an area of abiding interest for me, and quite a number of years before I went to study with Vasant Lad, I published a book through China's largest medical publishing house on pulse diagnosis, and it's a fundamental concept from about the 1400s that was published in about 2002, maybe 8 years ago, 2000, and we did case studies. Since then, I have published a book called Neoclassical Pulse Diagnosis, which essentially takes pulse diagnostic techniques for acusystems from the Han Dynasty, essentially, classics, and reconstructs them into a contemporized view. There are concepts that weave extremely well with the astrological consideration, and have to do with eightfold divisions of the wheel as opposed to 12. And we see this in India, we see it in Greece, we see it in China, and it fits with, the 12 houses have this very tight coherence with the meridian systems of acupuncture and acupressure, right? There are 12 main channels. The energy moves through each of those channels every 2 hours. So it is directly coherent with the movement of the sun through the 12 houses of the sky. Assuming whole sign houses in an equatorial scenario, such they're perfect 2 hour segments, that would be the case. But in any regard, the chart gives us a way to understand which planetary frequencies are played to the body where, based on the heavenly stems, you can call them, the branches and stems, the connection between heaven and the human as a 12-fold division, which is ultimately an interweaving of twos and threes, of oppositions and harmonizations. That pathway of 2 and 3 has a cosmological root, not terribly dissimilar from that of Kabbalah or Taoism, where there's a unity field, and then there's a bifurcation of light and particle, or wave and particle, but that bifurcation, and then the third point of resolution, which is the transdisciplinary view. It's the both and view, transcending Aristotelian logics of this is this and that is that. And it is from that perspective that we're able to discern and harmonize and create some type of a healing process.
Well, I'm very grateful that you've been able to synthesize that bifurcation within yourself, because we too, as an astrological community, tend to get stuck between that bifurcation of old and new. And we do have this piece where, insofar as we're trying to hold on to the fidelity of one portion of our astrological development, we don't necessarily always interact with another portion of our astrological development. But it's lovely and it's refreshing to hear you, as a Renaissance astrologer in the truest sense of the term, in terms of continuously being reborn and continuously taking part in the bounty of the now. I think it's completely wonderful to hear that you're synthesizing these practices within your practice and focusing on what is concrete, even more than focusing on what is ancient. Because I think that there's something very important about us coming back to the concrete, practical, tangible ways in which our astrology has effects within the lives of the people who we work with. And I just love how medicine as a field in general always demands the utmost honesty on our parts, and it also demands the utmost pragmatism on our parts, because it demands that we do what works. And from what I'm hearing from you, you're definitely aligning yourself with what works wherever it comes from. And I'm really grateful to be able to be in this space with you, because I think that we need more of these sorts of conversations within our astrology.
Yeah, and I'm also very appreciative of the fact that you are drawing upon that interest and creating a place for that voice to be heard. That awareness is requisite for creating such a safe place for such a dialogue to emerge, and greatly appreciated that. Yeah.
Most definitely will. Now, Will, for our listeners and viewers who are interested in studying to become medical astrologers, and they're feeling really inspired by what you're saying right now in terms of what you practice and what you teach, in terms of this intersection between medical astrology proper as well as sound vibrational healing, what steps do they need to take in order to begin their studies, and also how can they study with you?
Okay, I can be reached at wmorris33@gmail.com. Also, you can just go Will Morris, PhD, and I'll show up in the somewhere out there on Google. That'll come down, and yeah, I have and also doctorate in Chinese medicine, doctor of acupuncture and ortho medicine. So that's one way. I have a course coming up towards the third week of July. We teach it on Wednesday evenings, 5 p.m. Pacific time, and this one's going to be medical astrology for herbalism. I separate them out. So, of course, on medical astrology for homeopathy, those are different concepts. Medical astrology for sound healing, which also involves systems-based thought. There are three different courses that are available. Then we also have here at where I live and work at the Kootenay Sound Healing Centre. We have ongoing programs where we're teaching sound healing, and the sound healing is all based on the astrological consideration. So those are ongoing, but I can be reached for the herbal course, which if people don't have a background in herbalism, I have a free 5-hour preparation that develops concepts around systems-based thought in herbal medicine, in particular for this current epidemic that we're in. But still, it's a systems-based form of thought, which I teach at the doctoral level as well. That's herbal for people that are that kind of a bent in life. But here we're working on the intersectionality of the herbal prescription with and based upon astrological considerations, and that begins in just a few weeks now. Yeah.
Okay.
So again, W Morris, WMORRIS 33@gmail. This is where people can find me, or my Facebook page, or Kootenay Sound Healing Centre, kshc.ca.
Awesome. So I'll put all of that information down in the description box below for our listeners and viewers to be able to reach out to you. Well, another question that I have for you is, when I was studying to become an Ayurvedic counselor, we were told afterwards that, hey, this is just the beginning. Now go off and study with Vasant Lag, or go out and study some other branch of traditional medicine in order to really root yourself in this tradition. What I want to know from you is, after studying with you, where is it you encourage your students to go, or would you like for them to come to you with a certain educational background in this field first in order for them to get the most from your program?
Well, the astrological portion of these workshops begins from the ground up. I have no expectations about prerequisites when people arrive, because people come from all kinds of places. You know, the main thing is to have a passion, a drive, you know, a burning in the soul for this, for healing. This is what brings the person to the path. Now, the conversation may go in any number of directions, but if a person has no background in herbal medicine, I'm going to recommend that they go study more herbs. Because herbs is a lifetime study. Similarly for homeopathy, any of these techniques are a lifetime study. But it depends on the individual. You know, if people come into sound healing, oftentimes are body workers. And so that the sound healing fits great for all of this stuff. But everyone's got a background, blood lineage background. If you go back far enough, so many in the families doing this stuff. It's good to get in touch with that, you know. And so it really depends. Some people, I'll encourage them to go to Chinese medicine school. Thing is that's expensive these days, you know. And it's hard in this current world to recommend that people use debt to manage education. So I have, as time has gone on, become more and more interested in the unlicensed underground practice of these types of disciplines that belongs in the hands of the people and not that of the state. So, but that's my personal agenda. I'll stand by it. Having been served as an agent of the state in certain contexts as advisors to licensing boards or to research institutional review boards and so forth, and all these agency processes or schools formally having taken schools as a president to regional accreditation status. This is all confirmation with state agenda. It is not the soul of the individual as a potent healer. And this is what I'm interested in.
Now, well, I think the next thing that comes up for me, and it probably is coming up for others as well, is what career opportunities are there for someone after having studied medical astrology? Do they use it as an adjunct to something that they're already doing? Or is there an uncharted territory for medical astrologers in the world that you've seen people actively engaging in after having graduated from a medical astrology program?
Okay, so a medical astrology program in and of itself is insufficient to develop medical skills. So one has to pursue, there's two parts of the equation. One's medicine, the other's astrology. It's just like if you're a financial astrologer, right? You'd have to study financial systems. One would have to understand GAN and all the different investment models and how these things work. You have to understand how all that works and the astrology. And that's what makes for a really excellent business or investment-centered astrologer. Yeah, and so similarly with medicine, one has to study a form of medicine. What I've found that's extremely well adapted to the astrologer, of course, is the sound healing techniques. It's phenomenal. But still, studying anatomy, physiology, all these things are necessary. If one's going to operate at the intersection of two disciplines, one must gain some mastery in each of those disciplines.
Well, I completely agree with you on that front, and I am all about astrologers diversifying their background and going out and studying other aspects of our human condition. Because, I mean, when I wanted to improve my counseling skills, I went out and I became a hypnotherapist. I also have done yoga for so long and the Ayurveda. And I think that having a well-rounded understanding of the human, not just psychologically or spiritually, but also physically and emotionally and subconsciously, are really important for us as astrologers, especially if we feel drawn to using astrology as a means of healing. Once again, whether that's physical healing, mental healing, emotional healing, spiritual healing, helping people to heal their subconscious patterns, I think that it's really important that we have that extra knowledge behind us so that we can stand in those fields and really do the most amount of good for our clients.
Yeah, that's a beautiful message. And that's one worth supporting. And I support it 100%.
Well, this has been really wonderful speaking with you this evening. But before we head out, I know that you have published quite a few books. Can you tell our listeners about the books that you've published and also where they can purchase those books?
Sure. I can be found as an author on Amazon. I have books in Chinese medicine, two that I did through People's Medical Publishing House, their largest publishing house, medical publishing house. One's called TCM Case Studies, Dermatology. I had spent 5 years under the tutelage of a dermatologist out of Shanghai. And so that led to that work, which came after my pulse diagnosis. My PhD was all focused on pulse diagnosis, which eventually became this book that came out this year, Neoclassical Pulse Diagnosis, which is in my own publishing house, which is 33 Publishing. It's here it's based in the U.S. But before that, I did a book called Li Shizhen. He's a famous physician, and Li Shizhen wrote the largest materia medica of herbal medicines to extent, and he also wrote on pulse diagnosis, and it became the core competencies for the mainstream aspect of pulse diagnosis within the TCM universities of China, and also the rest of the world correspondingly. So that book I'm super proud of. It's with People's. And then I actually wrote a book with my mother back in the 80s called Reiki Hands That Heal. And she was a Reiki master, and I put myself through acupuncture school teaching Reiki. That was fantastic. And then I've got a couple of other books, but right now I'm working on another book, Pulse Diagnosis for the Clinical Herbalist. And then there's some books on systems-based thinking for herbal medicine and astrology. And another book on homeopathy and astrology. These are all in the works. So sound healing, yeah, it's all the same. It's all the same. So it's astrology is the glue for me at this point in my life. I took some detours at certain points, but always the astrological consideration was there. It was there for me in making important high-level decisions as president of a university. It was even amongst my staff, they would take the astrological consideration if we were at a critical juncture in our decision-making process. It's always been there, and that's where I live and breathe.
And Will, just one more point. What's your mother's name?
Joyce Morris.
Joyce Morris.
Joyce Morris. Reiki Hands That Heal is the name of her book. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I would have come across that book before because I came into Reiki as a kid. I had a godmother who was a Reiki master, and then I went down the traditional Takata route and studied that for many, many years. So once again, I'm amazed at the ways in which our journeys, they're not the same, but parallel.
Many parallels. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah.
It really is amazing. And spending this time with you this evening, Will, was also completely wonderful. And I've learned so much from being here with you. And I'm so grateful that you're doing this work within the world, because more people need to stand in this middle place and stand skillfully there, where it's not just leaning towards one side or the other, but you're really making the best use of the intersection of the old and the new, of the orthodox and the unconventional, and really making it work in a way that's powerful and that's concrete and that yields tangible results. So thank you so much for doing that work.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation and getting to know you. I so appreciate you reaching out and asking me to come participate with you this way. It's a wonderful way to engage.
Well, I'm really happy about it, Will. And I have heard about you within the medical astrology circle for quite a while. And it's an honor to be able to sit down with you right now. So, once again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for sharing this space.
Thank you so much, Mychal.
And to our listeners and viewers out there, if this is your first time here with us on the Oraculos Truth of Nation podcast, or if this is your 100th time, I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for holding this space with us and also sharing us here in my virtual astrological living room. It really means the world to me. I receive your comments, I receive your feedback. Most importantly, I receive your love. So thank you for being here with us. And please remember to like this video as well as to subscribe to the Oraculos Truth of Nation podcast. And most importantly, share this video with your other astrologically minded colleagues and friends, because more and more astrologers within our field need to know that these conversations are happening. So until next time, from the bottom of my heart, be well, be safe, talk to you soon. I love you, and bye-bye. Will Morris.
Wow, thanks so much, Mychal. Great interview. Loved it.
Yeah, this was great. Yeah.